The library bell rang twice before Marisol heard it, and even then, the sound seemed to reach her from a great distance, muffled by the rain that had been falling against the eastern windows of Ravensmere Hall for 3 uninterrupted days. She set down the ledger she had been reviewing, the one her husband believed his steward kept, though in truth she had taken over the accounts in the 2nd year of their marriage, when the old man's hands had begun to tremble too badly to write, and pressed her palm flat against the desk to steady herself before standing. 2 rings of the bell meant a visitor. 2 rings at this hour, in this weather, meant a visitor of consequence. She did not hurry. She had learned in 5 years as the Duchess of Ravensmere that hurrying betrayed eagerness, and eagerness was a currency she could not afford to spend on a household that had ceased to notice whether she walked or ran. She smoothed the front of her gray morning gown, the color of wet slate, chosen because it showed neither ink stains nor estate work, and crossed the long gallery toward the entrance hall. The portraits watched her pass. They always did. Generations of Ravensmere men with their cold blue eyes and their thin, disapproving mouths, and not a single woman among them whose name she could remember without consulting the family Bible. Halfway down the gallery, she paused. Voices were rising from the entrance hall. A man's voice she did not recognize, low and pleasant, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to command attention. And underneath it, the unmistakable sound of her husband's secretary, Mr. Pelham, who had served the Duke for 11 years and had never once met her eyes when she spoke to him, saying, with audible discomfort, "His Grace is not receiving visitors, my lord, if you would care to leave a card." "I will not be leaving a card," the pleasant voice replied. "I have ridden from Tarnscombe in the rain, and I will speak to him directly, or I will speak to her Grace. I assume one of them is at home." Marisol's hand found the cold marble of a side table and rested there. Tarnscombe. That was Lord Aubrey Crenshaw's seat. She had met him twice, once at a county assembly 4 winters ago, where he had asked her opinion on a piece of music and listened to her answer with a focus that had startled her into silence, and once at his late wife's funeral the spring before. He had not visited Ravensmere before. No one of consequence visited Ravensmere anymore. Her husband had made certain of that. She took a breath that did not quite reach the bottom of her lungs and stepped into the entrance hall. Lord Crenshaw stood just inside the threshold, water dripping from the hem of his greatcoat onto the marble floor. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired with a streak of early silver at his temple, and his face was the kind of face that gave nothing away unless its owner permitted it. When he saw her, he removed his hat at once and bowed. "Your Grace." "Lord Crenshaw." She inclined her head. "You are very wet." "I am, yes." "Mr. Pelham, please send for towels and have a fire lit in the small parlor. Lord Crenshaw will take refreshment before he speaks with anyone." Pelham hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the closed doors of the Duke's study at the far end of the hall, then back to her, and she watched him calculate whether her order superseded his master's standing instruction not to be disturbed. He bowed and departed. Lord Crenshaw watched the exchange in silence. When Pelham was gone, he said, quite mildly, "He had to think about it. He has a great deal to think about." "Does he?" It was not a question. It was the soft observation of a man who had already understood something she had spent 5 years pretending not to know. She turned away from him before her face could show what his words had done to her, and led him through to the small parlor at the front of the house. It was the warmest room in Ravensmere, and the only one she had been permitted to redecorate after her marriage. The walls were a pale primrose, the furniture upholstered in cream and faded rose, and a small fire was already lit in the grate. "Please," she said, gesturing to the chair nearest the fire. "Sit. Dry yourself. I will have tea brought." He did not sit. He stood with his back to the fire, his hands clasped behind him, and he looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Your Grace, I have not come to take tea." "I gathered as much, my lord, but you will take it nevertheless, because you have ridden through rain for 3 hours, and because whatever you have come to say will be said better warm than cold." A small, surprised smile touched his mouth, gone almost before she saw it. "As you wish." He sat. She rang for tea. She arranged herself in the chair opposite him, with the careful composure she had learned to wear like armor, and she waited. The tea arrived. He drank half a cup before he spoke. "Your Grace, I have come to ask your husband for the dissolution of your marriage, and if he refuses, I have come to ask you to leave him." The cup in her hand did not tremble. She would remember this afterward, that she had not spilled a drop, that her face had not changed, that her breath had remained even. 5 years of training in the art of betraying nothing had been preparation for precisely this moment, and she would not waste it. She set the cup down. "My lord, I do not know whether to laugh or to ask you to leave. Neither would be unreasonable. I would ask you to do neither yet. You have known me at 3 social occasions across 4 years. You buried your wife 18 months ago, and you have ridden through a storm to propose that I abandon a marriage that, whatever its imperfections, is sanctified by both church and law. I have. On what grounds, my lord, do you imagine I would entertain such a proposal?" He set down his own cup. He looked at her steadily, and when he spoke, his voice was not pleasant any longer. It was something else, something quieter and far more dangerous. "On the grounds, your Grace, that your husband has not slept under the same roof as you for 41 nights of the past year. On the grounds that he has not addressed you by your given name in the hearing of any of his servants for at least 3 years, and possibly longer. On the grounds that the last time you appeared in London during the season, he attended 17 events, and you attended 4, and at none of those 4 were you seen to speak to him for more than the duration of a quadrille. On the grounds that I have, since my wife's death, made certain inquiries in this county and the next, and I have not found a single tenant, a single servant, a single clergyman, or a single neighbor who believes you are loved in this house. And on the grounds, your Grace, that I have spent the better part of a year asking myself whether a man may, in good conscience, offer his hand to a woman whose hand has already been given. And I have concluded that he may, when the man to whom it was given has so plainly forgotten he holds it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain struck the glass. Marisol's hands lay folded in her lap, and she could feel each finger as if from a long distance away. "You have made inquiries about me." "I have." "For how long?" 21 months. She closed her eyes. 21 months. She had thought herself unobserved in this house, in this county, in this entire architecture of polite indifference her husband had constructed around her. She had thought no one was looking. Someone had been looking. For nearly 2 years, someone had been looking. "My lord," she said, and her voice came out lower than she had intended. "You cannot have considered what you are asking. The scandal is already there, your Grace. It walks beside you in every drawing room you enter. Every woman in the county knows your husband does not see you. Every man knows it. The only person who does not know it, I begin to suspect, is your husband himself. He sees me." The words came out before she could stop them, and she heard them as he heard them. Small, flat, unconvincing. The answer of a child insisting on something it has stopped believing. He did not press her. He let the silence press her instead, and the silence did its work, because she could feel the heat rising into her face and the slow, terrible cracking of something she had cemented over so carefully she had nearly forgotten it was there. The door opened. She did not turn. She did not need to. She had known, the moment the latch lifted, who would be standing there, because Mr. Pelham would have gone to fetch him the instant her back was turned, and the Duke had clearly chosen to come now, rather than later, for reasons of his own. Marisol. His voice, her name, spoken aloud, in this room, in the hearing of another man, for the first time she could remember, in longer than she wished to count. The sound of it struck her, between the ribs, with a force she had not braced for. She had taught herself, over the long, quiet years, not to listen for footsteps in the corridor at night, not to mark the hour of his return from London, not to wait for it. She had taught herself that the silence in this house was the weather of her life. And now her name in his mouth, a single word, 2 short syllables, the smallest possible undoing. And every careful lesson she had given herself was gone. She rose. She turned. Theron, Duke of Ravensmere, her husband of 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days, stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair untidy, his face the color of old paper. His eyes were not on her. His eyes were on Lord Crenshaw, and they held an expression Marisol had not seen on her husband's face in all the years she had known him. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was fear. "Crenshaw," the Duke said. His voice was hoarse. "What in God's name are you doing in my house?" Lord Crenshaw rose unhurriedly. He set down his teacup. He looked at the Duke, and then he looked at Marisol, and then he looked at the Duke again. And when he spoke, it was with the same dangerous quietness he had used a moment before. "I am asking your wife, Ravensmere, whether she will allow me to court her once you have released her. I had hoped to ask you first. You were not available." The Duke did not move. The clock on the mantel ticked once, twice, 3 times. And then, in a voice she had never heard him use before, a voice stripped of every layer of cold civility he had wrapped around himself, her husband said, very softly, "You cannot have her." Marisol felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had been a wife in this house for 5 years. She had been a duchess for 5 years. She had been a piece of furniture for 5 years. And in all of those years, her husband had never once, not at the altar, not at the wedding breakfast, not in the bed they had shared for the first 11 nights of their marriage, and not since, looked at her the way he was looking at her now. Lord Crenshaw inclined his head. "That, Your Grace," he said, "is not for you to decide. It is for her." And he turned, and he looked at Marisol, and he waited. She did not answer him. She could not. There was no answer in her. Not yes. Not no. Not any of the careful arrangements of words she had spent 5 years assembling for moments far less consequential than this. And so she did the only thing she could do, which was to lift her chin a fraction of an inch and say, in a voice that came from somewhere outside her body, "My lord, I will give you my answer in 3 days. You will receive my letter at Tarnscombe." Lord Crenshaw bowed. 3 days, Your Grace." He crossed the parlor without looking at the Duke. He paused at the doorway, only long enough to retrieve his hat from the side table where Pelham had placed it. And then he was gone, and she heard his boots on the marble, and the soft murmur of the front door, and the rain. The Duke did not move from the threshold. Neither did she. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the fire, and the rain, and the small, mechanical heartbeat of the clock. And Marisol thought, quite clearly, quite calmly, "I have been alone with my husband in this room perhaps 4 times in 5 years, and on every previous occasion he has spoken first. He didn't speak first." She gathered her skirts in one hand. She walked toward the door. He stepped out of her way. She passed within 6 inches of him, and she did not look at him. And the smell of him, bergamot and ink and the faint, cold trace of the rain that had reached him through the open front door went into her lungs like a hand closing around her ribs. She climbed the stairs. She entered the corner chamber she used now, chosen because it was the furthest from his. And she closed the door, and she turned the key, and she stood with her back against the wood, and she waited. She waited for the breaking. It did not come. She had expected to find herself sliding down the door and weeping the way the heroines of her old novels wept. Instead, she found herself standing very still in the center of her cold room, and the only thing she could feel was a small, sharp clarity, like the edge of a blade newly drawn. 21 months. He had been watching her for 21 months. She crossed to the writing desk by the window. She sat. She drew a clean sheet of paper toward herself, and she dipped her pen, and she began, almost without intending to make a list. Things I have done in the past 21 months that someone might have observed. She wrote until the rain had darkened from gray to slate, until the fire in the small grate had burned down to embers, until Mrs. Aldith knocked at the door with the soft, apologetic knock that meant supper had been ready for half an hour and her grace had not come down. "I am not hungry, Mrs. Aldith. Please have something sent up. Bread will do." "Yes, Your Grace." A pause. "Your Grace?" "Yes, Mrs. Aldith." The housekeeper's voice through the door was very gentle. "His Grace has gone out, Your Grace. He took his horse." He did not say where. Marisol's pen paused above the paper. "In this rain?" "In this rain, Your Grace." "Thank you, Mrs. Aldith." The footsteps retreated. Marisol set down the pen. She rose, and she crossed to the window, and somewhere far down the long avenue of Ravensmere, already half swallowed by rain and dusk, she saw the small, dark shape of a single horseman riding away from the house, at a pace she had not seen her husband ride in 5 years. The bread came. She did not eat it. When Mrs. Aldith returned to take the tray away an hour later, the older woman set it down again instead, and stood at a respectful distance, and said quietly, "You will eat, Your Grace, or I will sit here and wait until you do." Marisol looked up. Mrs. Aldith had served the Ravensmere household for 31 years. She had watched the previous Duchess die in childbirth. She had watched the Duke's mother decline. She had watched Marisol arrive at this house at 19 years old, in a wedding gown 2 sizes too large, because there had been no time to alter it, and she had not, in 5 years, ever stepped beyond the bounds of professional courtesy. She was stepping beyond them now. Marisol picked up the bread. She ate it. Mrs. Aldith watched her eat. And then, when she was finished, the housekeeper said, without preamble, in the same tone she used to discuss the linen, "There is a letter, Your Grace, in the locked drawer of his late mother's writing desk. The Duke does not know it is there. I have known it was there for 11 years. I think perhaps the time has come for you to read it." She set a small brass key on the table beside the bread plate. She curtsied. She left. Marisol looked at the key. The rain struck the glass. She did not move. She did not sleep. She lay awake in the cold dark of her corner room until the rain thinned to a fine gray mist over the gardens, and somewhere below the kitchen door opened to let out the cat, and the household began its slow inhalation back into another morning, and only then did she rise and dress herself without ringing for her maid, and take the brass key in her closed hand and walk the long corridor to the locked east room where the Duke's mother's things had stood untouched since the year before her wedding. The room smelled of dust and lavender and old paper. She had been inside it twice. The first time, 3 weeks after her arrival as a bride, when she had thought, naively, hopefully, that she might restore some of these rooms and bring the house back into use. Her husband had found her here. He had said only, "Not this room, Marisol," and he had left. She had not pressed. She had been 19, and his voice had carried no anger, only a quiet exhaustion she had not, then, known how to read. The second time had been the morning her husband's father had died, 2 years ago, when the Duke had locked himself in here for an entire afternoon. Mrs. Aldith had thought she ought to stand outside the door if he came out, and he had not come out, and she had returned to her ledgers in the small parlor without ever speaking to him. Now she was inside it again, and she was alone. The writing desk stood beneath a tall window. The lock on its small drawer was old and stiff, and her hand was unsteady, and she had to try the key 3 times before it turned. She turned it. The drawer slid open. There was no letter. There were 38 letters. They were tied together with a faded green ribbon, and they were all addressed in the same hand, a woman's hand, careful, sloping, untrained, but determined. And they were all addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Ravensmere, and the topmost letter was dated the 17th of August, in the year of our Lord, 1812. 4 years before her marriage. Marisol sat down very slowly in the small chair by the desk. She did not open the letters. She sat with her hand resting on the bundle, and she waited, because she had been a girl who read other women's letters once, when she was 12, and her mother had caught her, and her mother had said, without raising her voice, which was worse, "Marisol, a woman's letters are her soul committed to paper. You do not read another woman's letters unless she has died, or unless you have been given them." Mrs. Aldith had given her the key, but Mrs. Aldith hadn't given her the letters. She sat with that distinction for a long time, in the quiet of the locked room, and she understood that the housekeeper had chosen the harder kindness on purpose. To give her the letters would have been to make the choice for her. To give her the key was to leave the choice in her own hands. It was the first time in 5 years that anyone in this house had trusted her with a choice that mattered. She rose. She closed the drawer. She locked it. She put the key in her pocket. She left the room. And she went to find Mrs. Aldith. She found her in the still room, sleeves rolled to the elbow, weighing dried lavender for the linen presses. The older woman did not look up as Marisol entered. She simply continued her work, and after a long moment she said, "You did not read them." "No." "Why?" "Because they are not mine. And because, Mrs. Aldith, before I read them, I would like you to tell me what they are." The housekeeper set down the lavender. She wiped her hands on her apron. She turned, and she looked at Marisol for a long moment, with eyes that had watched 2 generations of Ravensmere men die in this house. And at last she said, "They are from a woman named Isolde Maranby. She was the daughter of an English vicar in the village near Salamanca, in Spain. She nursed His Grace through a fever for 6 weeks in the autumn of 1812, when the army left him for dead, and the village hid him in the cellar of the parsonage. She loved him. He left to rejoin his regiment in March of the following year. She wrote to him every month from October of 1812 until November of 1815, when her last letter was returned to her unopened, because His Grace had married you in October of that year, and his orders to Mr. Pelham were that no further correspondence from Spain was to be acknowledged. The room was very still. He never wrote back. He wrote to her once, Your Grace, in the spring of 1815, before he was sent abroad a second time on his father's errand. The letter is not in that drawer, because she returned it after his marriage. I do not know what it said. I know only that after he received it back, he locked himself in his study for 3 days, and when he came out, he did not speak my name, or his sister's name, or any servant's name, or your name, for a fortnight. Marisol pressed her hand flat against the wall behind her, because the wall was cold, and the cold was the only thing in the room that felt real. She thought of her wedding morning 6 years ago, and of how her husband, Her bridegroom, then, only just become so, had stood at the altar of the small chapel at Adenholt, with his eyes fixed on the stained glass window above the priest's head, and not, for the entire duration of the service, on her face. She had taken it then for shyness. She had taken it in the years since for indifference. She had not, until this moment, considered that it might have been grief. Did he love her? Mrs. Aldith's eyes were steady. I think, Your Grace, that the question is not whether he loved her. Then what is the question? The question is what happened to her, between his last letter and your wedding, that made her stop writing for 6 months and then send back the unopened ones. The question is why a vicar's daughter in Salamanca knew, in the autumn of 1815, that she could no longer write to a man who had not written to her in person since the spring. The question, Your Grace, is who told her. Marisol's heart was beating in her throat now, hard, like something trapped. Who told her, Mrs. Aldith? The older woman did not answer. She picked up the lavender. She resumed weighing it. And only after she had set the small brass weight back into its place did she say, very quietly, His Grace's aunt arrives at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Your Grace. Lady Honora Vane. She has not set foot in this house in 11 years. She wrote to Mr. Pelham yesterday and announced her arrival. He has not yet found the courage to inform His Grace. I think, perhaps, that you should be the one to receive her. Marisol stared. His aunt has not been in this house in 11 years. No, Your Grace. Not since the year before His Grace returned from Spain. She had a quarrel with the late Duke that no one in this household has spoken of in my hearing. I know only that she swore at the time she would not cross that threshold while her brother lived, and after his death, she did not cross it either, because by then her quarrel had become a habit. Why is she coming now? Mrs. Aldith set down the weight. She looked at Marisol, and she said, Because, Your Grace, the news of Lord Crenshaw's visit reached Vane House by yesterday's evening post, and whatever her ladyship has been waiting 11 years to say, she has, I believe, decided to say it now. Lady Honora Vane arrived at 3 minutes past 4 in a traveling carriage drawn by 4 black horses, and she did not wait for the steps to be lowered before she stepped down into the gravel drive of Ravensmere Hall. Marisol watched her from the small parlor window. She was a tall woman, perhaps 60, dressed in mourning gray edged with black silk braid, and she walked toward the front door of her nephew's house with the bearing of a woman who had decided, somewhere on the long road from Vane House, that she would not be turned away. Marisol met her in the entrance hall. Your ladyship, you are very welcome at Ravensmere. The older woman did not curtsy. She lifted her veil instead, slowly, and looked at Marisol with eyes the same cold blue as Theron's, and at last she said, You are smaller than I expected, child. He must have made you smaller. It was not a cruel observation. It was something worse. It was diagnosis. Will you take refreshment, your ladyship? I will take it in the small parlor, not the drawing room. I have not entered the drawing room of this house in 22 years, and I do not propose to begin now. As you wish. Marisol led her to the parlor. Lady Honora settled herself in the chair Lord Crenshaw had occupied the day before, and she observed this fact, and she said, So this is where he sat. You knew he was here? Half the county knew within an hour, child. The grooms at Tarnscombe talked to the grooms at the Dunmore coaching inn, and the grooms at Dunmore talked to my coachman. She accepted her tea. She did not drink it. She looked at Marisol the way a physician looks at a patient who has been concealing the location of the pain. Tell me, child, what did Crenshaw say to you? That is not a question I am at liberty to answer, your ladyship. It is precisely the question you are at liberty to answer, because I am the only person in England who can tell you what to do with the answer. Tell me what he said. Marisol drew a slow breath. She told her. She told her with the same composure she had used in the parlor the day before, and she watched Lady Honora's face, and she saw the older woman's mouth tighten once at the mention of 41 nights, and again at the mention of 3 years without her given name. When Marisol had finished, Lady Honora was silent for a long time. Then she said, "He has done worse to you than I feared." "Your ladyship, be quiet, child. Let me think." Marisol was quiet. After perhaps 2 full minutes, Lady Honora opened her eyes. Marisol had not realized she had closed them, and said, "You have not yet read the letters." Marisol's hand moved involuntarily to her pocket, where the brass key lay. "Mrs. Aldith told you." "Mrs. Aldith has written to me every quarter for 11 years, child. She is the only reason I have known you were still alive in this house." The room tilted slightly. "Every quarter? I have a folio of her letters at Vane House 2 inches thick, and I have read it twice in the past month because I knew this day was coming." She paused. "You did not know?" "No, your ladyship. No. He would not have wanted you to know. It would have implied that someone, somewhere, was paying attention." Lady Honora reached across the small space between their chairs and placed one cool, dry hand briefly over Marisol's. "Listen to me, child. I am going to tell you 3 things. Then I am going to leave this house, because I cannot bear to remain inside it after sunset. And tomorrow morning you will come to Vane House and tell me what you have decided." "Yes, your ladyship." "First, the woman in those letters did not die." Marisol's heart misstepped. "She is alive?" "As of last autumn, she was alive, and teaching the daughters of an English merchant family in Lisbon. I had a man make inquiries. I will give you his name and his findings tomorrow. But she—" "Second." Lady Honora's voice did not rise, but it cut. "My nephew did not abandon her of his own free will." The room was very still. "Then who?" "Third, child. The person who wrote to Isolde Merrenby in October of 1815 in my nephew's name and using a copy of his seal, informing her that he was to be married within the month and forbidding any further correspondence. That person was my late brother, my nephew's father, the previous Duke of Ravensmere." The fire crackled. Marisol's hand was very cold. "His own father. His own father, child, who arranged your marriage to my nephew in the spring of that year, who sent him back to Spain to fetch certain papers from a regimental colleague in July, and who, while he was gone, intercepted 3 letters from Salamanca and burned 2 of them and answered the 3rd in my nephew's hand. By the time my nephew returned in September, the engagement had been announced in the London papers, and a letter from Spain had reached him at his club, informing him that Miss Merrenby had withdrawn her affections. He believed it. He believed it because his father told him the announcement of the engagement had reached Spain before he himself could write to her, and that she had taken his silence as confirmation, and that she had accepted another man within the fortnight. He believed it because his father wept when he told him. He believed it because he was 26 years old, and his father had never given him cause to question his word. And he married you in October because he had given his word, and because he had nothing else left to give anyone, and because he had decided he would not poison your life with the ghost of a woman who had not wanted him. So he did not speak of her. He did not speak of Spain. He did not, in the end, speak much of anything. And you, child, were 19, and you assumed that a man who did not speak to you did not wish to, which was the conclusion he intended you to reach. Marisol could not move. She could not look away from the fire. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Aubrey Crenshaw is a good man, child. He is a better man, in many of the ways that matter most, than my nephew has ever permitted himself to be. and if you choose him, I will not stand in your way. But you cannot choose, child, until you know. So tomorrow you will come to Vane House. I will give you the man's findings, and then you will decide what to do with the rest of your life, with all the facts in your hand for the first time." Lady Honora rose. She picked up her gloves. She did not drink her tea. At the door of the parlor, she paused, and she said, almost gently, "He does not know yet, child, that she is alive. I have not told him. I think perhaps that the person who should tell him is not me." She left. The carriage wheels turned in the gravel. Marisol sat in the parlor as the fire burned low, and she did not weep, because something larger than weeping had taken up the whole of the room. She had been the second choice. No, she had been the replacement, the arranged piece of furniture, the polite ending to a story that had been written before she had ever heard her husband's name. And he had not known, and she had not known, and someone, somewhere, a woman she had never met, in a country she had never seen, had spent 4 years writing letters that had never been answered. She rose at last. She walked to the writing desk in her corner room. She drew out a clean sheet of paper. She dipped her pen. She wrote 3 words, and then she stopped. "Lord Crenshaw." Wait. She did not finish the sentence. She set the pen down, and she folded the unfinished letter, and she put it inside her writing case, and she sat with her hands flat on the desk, and she watched the rain begin again against the eastern window of the house. She slept 4 hours. She rose before the household, and she dressed in her plainest riding habit, and she had Tobin saddle the gray mare without telling Mrs. Aldith where she was going, and she rode out through the kitchen gate at 6:30 in a fine, settling mist that clung to the dark hedges of the lane. Vane House lay 7 miles to the north. She did not take the road. She took the bridle path that ran through Greyholme Common and along the upper edge of the Ravensmere tenant farms, because she had ridden it 100 times in 5 years, and because she needed, this morning, to ride past every one of the farms she had come to know. Past the Whitlock's barn, where she had sat with the youngest child through 3 nights of croup last winter. Past the Yarrow cottage, where she had paid the doctor's fee from her own pin money when the harvest failed. Past the chapel at Edenholt, where she had funded the new roof, and to ask herself what she would lose if she left. The answer was not what she had expected. The answer was, they will be cared for either way, because Lord Crenshaw is a good man, and because Theron, whatever else he has been, has never neglected the tenants the way he has neglected me. She rode on, and as she rode, she thought of her own father, dead these 5 years, and of how little she had truly known him. He had been a kind man at the dinner table and a remote one in his study, and she had loved him without ever quite reaching him. And she wondered now, with the mist clinging cold to her cheek, whether the distance had had a name she had never been told. She arrived at Vane House at 8:15, and Lady Honora was already dressed and waiting in a small breakfast room overlooking a walled garden where the first of the autumn crocuses had begun to come up. "Sit, child. Eat. You have not eaten. How can you tell? Because women who have spent the night thinking do not eat in the morning. Sit. Toast and a coddled egg. Then we will speak." She ate. When she had eaten, Lady Honora pushed a folded paper across the table. "The man's name is Hartwell. He is a London solicitor. He went to Lisbon in February of last year on a different matter, and I asked him to make inquiries in the English mercantile community while he was there. The household is the Caverleys. They have 3 daughters. She was engaged as their governess in 1817. She had been in a convent in Coimbra before that. She uses her mother's surname now, Lorenzo. She is not married." Marisol's hands rested on either side of the folded paper, and she did not yet pick it up. Has she ever returned to England? Once, in the spring of 1819, for 4 days. She did not visit this county. She did not visit London. She visited a single grave in a churchyard in Dorset, the grave of a child whose burial register lists no father. The room held its breath. His child. Born in May of 1813, died of fever before her first birthday. He never knew. Marisol pressed her hand to her mouth. She did not cry. She held it there until she could speak again, and then she said, very quietly, "Your ladyship, you cannot tell him this. No, child, you cannot. I will tell him. That is mine to do. But you needed to know, because I will not have you choose without knowing the full weight of what has been hidden in that house. Why are you giving me this? Why not give it to him? Why am I the one? Because, child, the woman in those letters has waited 11 years, and the man who wronged her is dead and cannot now be made to answer. And the man who was wronged alongside her has built a marriage on her absence. A marriage to a girl who deserved better than to be the unknowing instrument of his grief. And the only person in this whole long story who has not yet been allowed to act of her own will is you. So I am giving you the chance to act. Whatever you decide, I will support. If you go to Crenshaw, I will see that you are received in every house in the county. If you stay, I will see that my nephew is told what was done. But you must choose, child, with your eyes open." Marisol picked up the folded paper. She did not open it. She looked at Lady Honora across the breakfast table, and she said, "There is a thing I do not understand, your ladyship." "Yes. If your brother did this, if he arranged my marriage, and burned her letters, and forged her reply, why did he do it? There were 100 girls of my station he could have chosen. Why me?" Lady Honora's face changed. It was the first time that morning Marisol had seen her hesitate. "That, child, is the question I have been waiting for. I will tell you. But I will tell you, with the warning, that what I am about to say will alter the way you understand your own family. And I am not certain I have the right to alter it for you. Tell me, your ladyship." The older woman set her cup down. She said, "Your father and my brother were business partners for 19 years. The bulk of the Ravensmere mining interests in Cornwall were held jointly between them, on a trust whose terms required the survival of both estates in the male line. When my brother's son turned 25 without an engagement, my brother began to fear. The trust would have lapsed on his own death if my nephew remained unmarried, and the entirety of the Cornish income, which constituted more than half the Ravensmere annual receipts, would have reverted to your father's family. My brother did not fear the loss of the income, child. He feared what your father would do with it. He believed your father would have used it to force my nephew into a marriage he did not want, with one of your cousins, in exchange for the trust's renewal. Marisol could not breathe. He married me, to forestall my father. He married you, child, because you were the only daughter your father had, who could be married without your father's consent. Your father was already in declining health. He died 3 months after your wedding. The marriage settlement bound the trust permanently. The Cornish income remained in Ravensmere hands. My brother saved my nephew from one ruin and inflicted another in its place. And you, child, were the instrument by which it was done, without ever being told, by either of them. The walled garden beyond the window was very still. Somewhere, a single thrush was singing. Marisol set the folded paper down on the table, and she looked at her own hands as though she had not seen them in a long time, and she said, "My husband does not know this either." "He does not, child. My brother told no one. I learned of it only after his death, from his own papers. My nephew has lived for 5 years believing he married a girl he had no particular reason to marry, in a hurry he could not explain to himself, in obedience to a father whose motives he never questioned. And he has resented me. He has resented his life, child. You have been the most visible part of it. Marisol stood. She walked to the window. The thrush had stopped singing. She thought briefly of her wedding day, and of how her husband had not, in the carriage afterward, looked at her once. She had taken it for shyness. She had taken it for shock. She had not taken it, in any of the long evenings of the years that followed, for what it had actually been. The silence of a man who had been told, that morning, that the woman he had been writing to for 3 years had thrown him over for another, and had married, the same week, the girl his father had set in front of him. She said without turning, "Your ladyship, I am going home." To Ravensmere? To Ravensmere. Today. I will not write to Lord Crenshaw until I have spoken to my husband. I owe him that. I owe him, God help me, at least that much. And what will you say to him, child? Marisol turned from the window. Her face was very pale, but her eyes were dry, and her voice did not shake. I will say to him, Theron, there is a woman in Lisbon whose name is Isolde, and I think you should know that she is alive. Lady Honora rose. She crossed the room. She took Marisol by both hands, and she held them for a long moment. And she said, for the first occasion since their meeting, without any cool aristocratic distance, in the voice of an aunt who had waited 11 years to claim a niece, "My dear girl, he does not deserve you, but perhaps, after this, he will at last understand that he does not." She rode back faster than she had come. The mist had burned off. The sun was the color of pale honey through the high autumn cloud, and the bridle path was muddy in the low places. And she pushed the gray mare harder than she usually did, because she had a fear, ridiculous and certain, that if she did not reach Ravensmere before noon, something irrevocable would have happened in her absence. She was wrong about the hour. She was right about the irrevocable. She came up the long drive at 11:30, and she saw at once that there was a second carriage standing in the gravel, not Lord Crenshaw's, not Lady Honora's, but a small, dark London chaise she did not recognize, and a footman she did not recognize was holding the heads of the matched bays, and her stomach folded. Tobin took her mare without speaking. Mrs. Aldith met her at the side door. Mrs. Aldith's face was white. "Your Grace, who is here, Mrs. Aldith?" It is a Miss Carroway, Your Grace. She arrived an hour ago. She says she is his Grace's half-sister. Her mother has just died, and she has nowhere else to go. She is in the small parlor, and his Grace is with her, and he has not spoken since she walked in." Marisol pressed her hand briefly against the doorframe. His half-sister. On his father's side, Your Grace. From a marriage no one in this house knew about, made in secret, after her Grace, his mother, died, and dissolved within a year. The girl is 15. She has been raised in a girls' seminary in Bath since she was 4, and her mother died of consumption a fortnight ago, and the seminary forwarded her to His Grace this morning because there is no one else. Where is His Grace now? With her, Your Grace, in the small parlor. He has not yet sent for you. Marisol straightened her riding jacket. She removed her gloves. She handed them to a passing maid without looking at her. She walked to the small parlor. She did not knock. She opened the door, and she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her. Theron was standing at the window with his back to the room. A small, dark-haired girl in morning black sat in the chair by the fire, with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her eyes very large in a face that had not slept. She was perhaps 15. She had her brother's mouth, exactly his mouth, and the rest of her was a study in worn dignity. A well-mended dress, scuffed boots, a small leather traveling case at her feet. The absolute exhausted stillness of a child who has cried herself empty. Marisol crossed the room without speaking to her husband. She knelt in front of the girl. She took both of her cold hands. She said, in a voice she had not used since she was 19 years old, "My name is Marisol. I am your brother's wife. You are at home. You are very welcome here. Mrs. Aldith will have a room prepared within the hour, and a bath, and a tray, and you will not have to speak to anyone today if you do not wish it. But before any of that, child, what is your name?" The girl's mouth trembled. "Selka, Your Grace. Selka Caraway." "Selka, that is a beautiful name. I've not heard it before. My mother chose it. She said it meant. She said—" She broke. Marisol gathered her in. The girl wept against her shoulder for a very long time, and Marisol held her, and she could feel, without turning to look, that Theron had moved from the window. He was standing perhaps 3 paces behind her now, and he was not breathing properly. And when at last the girl's weeping had quieted into the slow, hiccuping aftermath of grief, Marisol said, very softly, over the top of Selka's head, "Theron, send for Mrs. Aldith. Have the green guest room aired. Have a doctor sent for from Dunmore, not for any illness, but because she has traveled 3 days and not eaten. And send for Mr. Pelham. We will write to the seminary today, and to her mother's solicitors, and we will inform them that Miss Caraway is now a member of this household, and will remain one for as long as she lives or wishes." He did not answer. But she heard him cross the room. She heard the bell ring. She heard him speak to Pelham, quickly, low. When he had finished, he came back, and he stood very close behind her, and he put his hand, for the first time she could remember, flat against the center of her back, between her shoulder blades, and he held it there. Selka was asleep against her shoulder. Marisol did not move. She did not turn. She said, only just loud enough for him to hear, in a voice that was not quite her own, "We have to talk, Theron. Tonight, after she is settled. There are things you do not know. There are things I have only just learned." His hand pressed once against her back. It was not a caress. It was something far more terrible. It was the first answer he had ever given her. And then he said, almost too quietly to be heard at all, "Marisol, there are things you do not know either. I have been a coward for 5 years. I will not be a coward tonight." Outside, the mist began to lift, and the rain, for the first occasion in 4 days, held off, and the long autumn light fell across the gravel of Ravensmere. Selka was settled in the green guest room by 3:30. Mrs. Aldith had been gentle with her in a way Marisol had not seen her be gentle in 5 years, combing the girl's hair herself, sitting in the chair by the bed until the child's breathing evened. And Marisol stood in the corridor for a long moment after Mrs. Aldith emerged. The doctor came at 4. He pronounced the girl exhausted, but sound, and he left. Theron walked the doctor to his carriage. He came back inside. He stood in the entrance hall with the door closed behind him, and he looked at Marisol across the long marble floor, and he said, "My study? Now." It wasn't the voice of the husband she had known. She followed him. The study was a long room lined with books that had not been opened since his father's death. He stood by the fire, and he said, before she had even closed the door, "There is a child." She had not expected this opening. What? A child? In Spain? Or there was. I have suspected her for 14 months. I have not told you. I am telling you now, because whatever happens in the rest of this conversation, I will not begin it with another concealment. Marisol pressed her hand briefly to the back of the chair nearest the door. You have known. I have suspected. I had a letter, 14 months ago, from a man in Cadiz who had served under me. He had heard a rumor. I tore the letter up. I burned the pieces. I told myself the man was mistaken or seeking money. And I did not investigate, because if I investigated, and the rumor was true, I would have to do something about it. I had spent 4 years convincing myself there was nothing left in Spain to do anything about. I was a coward. His voice did not break, but something behind it did. Marisol drew a very long breath. Theron, the child is dead. He looked at her. He did not move. Say that again. The child is dead. She died of fever before her first birthday. She is buried in a churchyard in Dorset, in a grave that lists no father. Your aunt's solicitor confirmed it last spring. Lady Honora told me this morning. She wished, my love, that I should know first, so that I could decide whether to leave you before she tore the rest of your life open. She had not meant to say my love. It came out before she could stop it. She watched the precise moment when a man who had not wept since his father's funeral understood that he was going to weep, and that there were no walls left in him that had not already fallen. He sat down on the floor in front of the fire, with his back against the desk, and he put his head in his hands, and Marisol crossed the room and lowered herself onto the rug beside him, and she did not touch him. He wept without sound. It was the worst kind of weeping she had ever witnessed. She waited. When at last he could speak, he said into his hands, I never knew her name. Whose name? The child's. Isolda. I left in March of 1813. The army moved north. I was never told. His voice failed. I would have come. Marisol, I swear before God I would have come. I know. How can you know? Because your aunt told me everything. About your father, about the letters, about my own father, and the trust, and the Cornish mines, and the marriage that was made for me before I had ever heard your name. Your father wrote to her in October of 1815, in your hand, with your seal. He told her you were to be married within the month. She believed it. She is alive, Theron. She is in Lisbon, and she is not married, and she does not know you did not write that letter. He raised his head. His face was wet. He said, My father, your father. Yes, and mine in his way. A trust on the Cornish mines. A daughter who could be married without paternal consent. A girl in Spain who had to be silenced. They did not consult either of us. We have both been the unknowing instruments of an arrangement we never agreed to. He stared at her. Marisol, I am so. Do not apologize yet. There is one more thing I must say to you, and then I will let you say whatever you wish. Yes. She drew breath. Lord Crenshaw asked me yesterday to leave you. I told him I would write in 3 days. I will not write tonight. But I will write, to you or to him, and I will not write either letter until I have asked you a question, and you have answered without lying. Ask me. If your aunt told you tomorrow morning where Isolde Merrenby is, would you go to her? He was silent for a long time. The fire shifted. When he spoke, it was almost a whisper. 6 months ago. Yes. Without thinking. Yesterday morning? Yes. Today. He stopped. Today, Marisol, my sister is asleep upstairs in a house I have made into a tomb, and my wife is sitting on a rug in front of me with her hand near my hand, and she has not yet taken it. And the woman I loved when I was 26 is alive in a country I have not seen in 6 years. I will tell you the truth. I do not know. But I know what I want. What do you want? I want to be the man my sister woke up needing today. I want to be the man who deserved the wife who has been running this estate for 5 years, while I pretended I was running it. I want to be the man who can write to a woman in Lisbon and say, I am sorry, and mean it. I want, God help me, Marisol, to be present in my own life. And I want, if you can bear it, to be present in yours." She put her hand over his on the rug between them. He turned his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, and the fire burned low. At length, she said, "There is something else, Theron. Yes. I do not know whether I can forgive you yet. I would not ask you to. But I am not going to write to Lord Crenshaw tomorrow. I am not writing, because I do not yet know my answer. I am going to stay at Ravensmere until your sister is settled. I am going to remain your wife in the eyes of this household. But I am not promising you anything beyond that. I have been a wife in name for 5 years. I will not now be a wife in name to a man who has finally noticed me, only because he has finally noticed me. If I stay, it will be because I have chosen, with my eyes open, to stay. Do you understand? Yes. Say it. I understand. You owe me nothing. Whatever you choose, I will not stand against you. And whatever you choose, I will spend the rest of my life, Isolde or no Isolde, Crenshaw or no Crenshaw, being a better man than I have been. Because my sister deserves it. Because you deserve it. And because, somewhere in the past 3 days, I have remembered that I am still alive. And the dead do not get to keep the living company. Not any longer. Not in this house. She closed her eyes. She held his hand. And outside, the long bell of Edenholt Chapel began to toll the hour, and Marisol thought, without bitterness, without fear, with only the strange, clear stillness of a woman who has at last been told the truth. Whatever happens now, I am no longer alone in this house. The next 3 days were the hardest of her marriage. They were also, in ways she could not have predicted, the first 3 days she had ever spent inside it. She wrote to Lord Crenshaw on the 2nd morning. She wrote without consulting Theron, because the letter was hers, and because she had told him she would not write a letter she did not mean. She sat at the desk in the small parlor, and she dipped her pen and she wrote, "My lord, I am asking you for a delay you have no obligation to grant. There are circumstances within this household that I learned of only after your visit, which require my immediate attention and which alter, in ways I cannot yet fully measure, the question you put to me. I am not refusing you. I am asking you for 6 weeks. If, at the end of 6 weeks, I write to you again, you may trust that the letter will contain my full and final answer, given with the consideration you deserve and the honesty you have already shown me. If you cannot grant me the delay, I will understand, and I will write to you tomorrow with my answer as it stands tonight. I will not lie to you, my lord, in either letter. Marisol, Duchess of Ravensmere. She sealed it. She sent it by the morning post. His reply came back at noon the following day, on a single sheet, in a hand she now recognized. Your Grace. 6 weeks is a small thing to ask of a man who has already waited 21 months. You shall have 8, if you prefer them. I will not write to you again until I hear from you. Aubrey Crenshaw. She folded the letter. She placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. She did not show it to Theron. She did not need to. The household reorganized itself around Selka in a way Marisol had not believed Ravensmere capable of. Mrs. Aldith uncovered a small writing slope that had belonged to Theron's mother and gave it to the girl on the 3rd morning. Mr. Pelham, who had not, in 11 years, addressed a single remark to Marisol that was not strictly necessary, began, on the 4th day, to bring the household correspondence to the small parlor rather than the Duke's study, and to ask whether she had instructions before he carried it back. He did not apologize. She did not ask him to. They both understood what had shifted. Theron sat with Selka every morning. Marisol watched him do it from the gallery window above the rose walk. He did not know how to be a brother. He had never had a sister. He learned by sitting beside her in silence for the first hour, and by asking her the names of the trees in the garden on the second morning, and by listening to her cry on the third, and by reading aloud to her on the fourth from a book of folk tales that had belonged to his own mother. Lady Honora wrote to Isolde Maranby on the fifth day. She did not show the letter to anyone. She sent it under her own seal, by private courier, to Lisbon, and she informed Marisol of this only in a brief note that said, "It is done. The reply, if there is one, will come to me, and I will bring it to you both." On the seventh evening, Theron came to her room. He knocked. He had never knocked at the door of her room. She opened it. He stood in the corridor in his shirt sleeves, holding a small wooden box, and he said, quietly, without any of the careful aristocratic distance she had grown to expect, "Marisol, I would like to give you something. I would like you to refuse it if you do not want it, but I would like you to see it first." He came in. He set the box on her writing desk. He opened it. Inside was a single object, a small, plain silver locket on a slender chain, of the kind a girl of 19 might have worn, and the kind no woman of 29 would wear unless it had once been precious to her. "This was yours," he said. "Your mother's before you. It came to me with your dowry in a sealed casket. I never opened it. I never asked. Mr. Pelham showed it to me yesterday. He has been keeping it in the strong room for 5 years. He thought perhaps that you should have it." Marisol sat down on the edge of the chair by the desk. She had not seen the locket since her wedding morning, when her mother had pressed it into her hand, and said, through tears Marisol had not understood at the time, "Whatever happens, my dear, this is yours. Do not let them take it from you." She had thought it lost. She had grieved it lost. For 5 years she had grieved it lost, and now her husband was setting it on the writing desk in her own room and saying he had not known. The sin of this house, she thought, had never been cruelty. It had been the absence of attention. She did not weep. She took the locket in her palm. She closed her hand around it. She said, without looking up, "Theron, thank you. Marisol, please. Not tonight. I cannot. Not tonight. But thank you." He bowed. He left. He did not press. She sat with the locket in her closed hand for a long time after the door had closed, and she did not put it on, because she was not yet ready, but she did not put it away either. And when at last she went to bed, she placed it on the small table beside the lamp, and she fell asleep with her hand resting beside it. And the rain, which had begun again at sundown, struck the window in a slow, steady rhythm that she did not, for the first occasion in 5 years, find lonely. The reply from Lisbon came on the morning of the 22nd day. Lady Honora brought it in person. She arrived at Ravensmere unannounced, at 10:15, in the same traveling carriage and the same morning gray. And she walked into the small parlor where Marisol was teaching Selka a piece of plain embroidery. And she said, without preamble, "Where is my nephew?" "In the library, your ladyship." "Both of you. Now, the child as well, if she will come. She has a right." Selka looked up. "A right to what, your ladyship?" Lady Honora's face softened. Marisol had not, in 3 meetings, seen it soften, and she said, "To know who your brother is, child, the whole of him. Come, it is time." They went together to the library. Theron was at the long oak desk, writing. He rose when they entered, and his eyes found his aunt's face, and he understood at once, and he set down his pen, and he said, "You have heard from her." "I have. Read it." Lady Honora drew the letter from her reticule. She unfolded it. She did not read it aloud at once. She looked at Theron, then at Marisol, then at Selka, who had crossed quietly to stand beside her brother, and had taken his hand without asking permission, in a gesture so small and so trusting that Marisol's throat tightened, and at last she read. The letter was not long. It was dated from Lisbon and addressed to Lady Honora Vane, with the gratitude of a stranger. Your Ladyship, I received your letter 10 days ago. I have read it 21 times. I will not pretend I did not weep. I will not pretend I have not been angry. Your late brother did me a great wrong, and your nephew a greater one, and there is nothing now to be done about it that can repair what was lost. The child of whom you wrote is buried under a yew tree in a churchyard in Dorset, where I visited her once, 6 years ago, and where I will visit her again in the spring of next year. I cannot bring her back. He cannot make me forget her. We are neither of us the people we were in the autumn of 1812. Tell your nephew this from me. I do not blame him. I have not blamed him for some years, because anger is a thing one cannot carry forever and live, and I have chosen to live. I have made a life here, with 3 girls in my care whom I love, and a small garden, and the sea within walking distance. I do not need his apologies, but I will accept them if he sends them, because we owe each other that much. I will not return to England except to visit my daughter's grave, and he is not to follow me there. Tell him, and please tell him precisely in these words, that the Theron Vane I knew in the autumn of 1812 would have gone home by now to the wife he was given, and would have been the husband she deserves. Tell him that if he has not yet, the time is past for excuses. And tell his wife, whose name I do not know, and to whom I have been a shadow for 5 years without ever wishing to be, that she has my regret and my goodwill, and that I hope she will not punish him for what he was kept from knowing. He was a kind boy, your Ladyship. I have to believe he is still, somewhere, a kind man. If he is not, it is your task and hers to remind him. Isolde Lorenzo. The library was very still. Theron had not moved. His face was wet, and the tears simply ran down his jaw and onto the collar of his shirt, and he did not seem aware of them. Marisol crossed the room. She took the letter from Lady Honora. She folded it. She placed it on the desk in front of Theron, and she put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, where she had never once put her hand in 5 years. And she said, "Theron, look at me." He looked. "I am going to write to Lord Crenshaw tomorrow." His face did not change, but his eyes. "I am going to write to him, and I am going to thank him for the courtesy he showed me, and I am going to tell him that I am staying with my husband. Not because I owe you anything, not because of Isolde's letter, but because I have spent the past 3 weeks watching a man I did not know existed remember how to live, and I find, and I am as surprised by this as anyone, my love, I do not wish to leave that man before I have known him properly." He could not speak. She said, "Do you accept this answer, Theron?" He nodded. He nodded once, and again, and a third time, and then he caught her hand against his chest with both of his, and he pressed it there as though he would never let it go. And he said, in a voice that was nothing like the voice of the man who had stood in the doorway 22 days before, "Marisol, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I deserved the answer." Selka was crying. Lady Honora was not. But when Marisol turned to look at her, she saw that Lady Honora's eyes were closed and that her lips were moving in something that was almost, but not quite, a prayer. The Edenhold Harvest Ball was held in the 3rd week of October in the long assembly rooms above the Market Hall in Dunmore, and the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere had not attended together in 3 years. They attended this year. They arrived at 8:30 in a carriage that had been polished until the lamps reflected in its panels, and Selka was with them, in a simple white gown that Lady Honora had made for her, with a sash of dove gray to mark her mourning. and the assembly rooms went very quiet for perhaps 3 full seconds when the 3 of them entered together, because every person in the room had heard, by now, that Miss Carroway had been received at Ravensmere, and that Lady Honora Vane had been seen there twice in a fortnight, and that the Duke had been observed riding with his wife on the upper road through Greyholme Common on a Sunday afternoon. What they had not heard was anything from Lord Crenshaw. He had not spoken of his ride to Ravensmere. He had not corrected the rumors. He had not, so far as any of them could tell, written to anyone of consequence about anything. He had simply, in the 2nd week of October, arrived in London on business and remained there. The county had concluded, with the absence of confirmation, that something had passed between Tarnscombe and Ravensmere, which neither side intended to explain. And the county was, for once, correct. He returned to Tarnscombe on the morning of the ball. He arrived at the assembly rooms at 9. Marisol saw him cross the floor before he saw her. He was alone. He was dressed plainly, in dark blue, and he moved through the crowd with the quiet, attentive courtesy he had used in her parlor. And when he reached the small group around the Duke and Duchess, he stopped. He bowed to Theron first. "Your Grace." "Lord Crenshaw." "I received Her Grace's letter last week. I came to thank her in person, with your permission, before the evening grows too late." Theron inclined his head. "You have my permission, my lord. You have, I think, far more than that. Please." Lord Crenshaw turned to Marisol. The room did not go silent. It pretended, quite hard, that it was not watching, and 1,000 small conversations continued, and the orchestra played a country dance, and not a single person there was unaware that the Duchess of Ravensmere was standing in front of the man who had ridden 3 hours through rain to ask for her hand, and that her husband was standing 6 feet behind her. Lord Crenshaw said, "Your Grace, thank you for your letter. Thank you for your courtesy. Thank you, most of all, for your honesty. I had hoped, I will tell you frankly, for a different answer. But I didn't ride to Ravensmere in October to take a woman from a husband who wanted her. I rode there to take a woman from a husband who did not. And it appears, your Grace, that I was, for the first time in 21 months of patient observation, wrong." He bowed. "I wish you both very well. I will not trouble you again. If, at any point in your life, your Grace, you have need of a friend who has the privilege of being neither your husband, nor your aunt, nor your servant, you will find me at Tarnscombe." He turned to Theron. "Take care of her, Ravensmere. I think you know now what you have." Theron bowed. "I do, my lord. I am. I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life." Lord Crenshaw smiled, very faintly, for the first time Marisol had seen. "Be grateful to her, your Grace, not to me." He bowed once more. He moved on. Marisol watched him go. He paused once, halfway across the floor, to bow to a young woman in pale yellow whom Marisol did not know, and then he was lost in the crowd, and she had the sudden, unaccountable certainty that he would not be alone for the rest of his life. There would be other women, better suited women. She hoped, with an intensity that surprised her, that he would find one of them. The orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz. Theron turned to Marisol. He did not speak. He held out his hand. He had never asked her to dance in the entire span of their marriage. He had stood through every assembly, every county ball, every London evening, with his hands clasped behind him and his eyes on the door, and he had never once asked her to dance. She placed her hand in his. He led her to the floor. The other couples gave way for them. He took her into the first position of the waltz, and he held her closer than was strictly proper, and he said, quietly against her hair, "Marisol, I have done 3 things in the past fortnight that I have not told you about. Theron, hear me. There is a deed in my study, dated yesterday, which transfers the freehold of the cottage at Yarrow Bottom into the name of the Yarrow family in perpetuity. They have lived there for 4 generations. I should have done it 5 years ago. Theron. There is a settlement of £700 a year, also in my study, also dated yesterday, in the name of Selka Carraway, which she will receive on her 21st birthday, regardless of who she has by then married, or whether she has married at all. She will not, my love, depend on me for her bread, or on any man ever. I have arranged it so. Marisol's eyes were wet. And the third thing, Marisol, is a deed of jointure, in your name, also dated yesterday, which gives you outright, my love, with no condition of survivorship and no reversion to me, the income of the Cornish mines for the remainder of your natural life. They were my father's price for our marriage. They were the reason he did what he did to Isolde and to us. I cannot give them back to her, but I can give them to you. They are yours. I cannot reach them, and no man living can take them from you. If you wish, on any morning, to leave this house and never return, you will do so as a woman of independent means. I have made it impossible, Marisol. Impossible, because I want you to know that whatever you do for the rest of your life, you will be choosing it freely. I have given up the only thing my father gave me that he should not have. I have given it to the only person in this story who has had nothing of her own. She stopped. In the middle of the waltz, in the middle of the floor. She stopped, and she looked up at him, and she said, in a voice that the nearest couple certainly heard, and the orchestra perhaps heard, and Lady Honora at the edge of the room certainly heard, because Marisol watched her hand rise to her mouth. Theron Vane, you absolute fool. I do not need the mines. I never needed the mines. I needed you to look at me. You are looking at me. Now dance, he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was the laugh, she suspected, of the boy who had been kind in 1812, who had been kept from her for 13 years by a father she had never properly mourned, and who was, at last, in the center of the assembly rooms, above the market hall in Dunmore, with half the county watching, coming home to himself. He pulled her back into the waltz. The orchestra played on. Lady Honora, at the edge of the room, did not weep, but she nodded very slowly, once to herself, or to the memory of her brother, or to the Cornish mines, or to nothing at all. And then she turned, and she went to find Selka, who was standing by the punch table being talked at by an elderly clergyman, and she took the girl gently by the elbow, and she led her back to where her brother was dancing with his wife. And the three of them, the Duke, the Duchess, and the half-sister, stood together at the edge of the floor when the waltz ended, and the assembly rooms applauded, and not a single person there could later swear what they had been applauding for, but every one of them remembered, for the rest of their lives, that they had been there on the night the Duke of Ravensmere remembered his wife. 6 months later, on a soft April morning, Marisol was in the small parlor of Ravensmere Hall, opening a parcel that had arrived from Lisbon. It was not large. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine, and it bore Isolde Lorenzo's careful, sloping hand on the direction. There was no letter inside, only a small object, wrapped in tissue, and a single line written on a folded card. For your sister. I think she is the right age. Isle Marisol unwrapped the tissue. It was a child's silver thimble, old, worn, engraved on the inside band, in letters so fine she had to turn it to the light to read them. H.M. from her mother, 1798. She sat for a long time with the thimble in her palm. She knew, without being told, that H.M. was the daughter who had died. She knew that Isolde had carried this thimble for 11 years. And she knew, with a certainty she could not have explained, that Isolde was telling them, gently, plainly, with the kind of grace that doesn't need words, that she was at peace, and that they should be at peace, and that the child was at peace also. She placed the thimble in the small wooden box on her writing desk. She would give it to Selka on her 16th birthday in July. Selka would understand. She rose. She walked through the long gallery, past the portraits, which still watched, but had stopped, somewhere in the past 6 months, watching her in particular, and out through the south door into the rose garden. Theron was there. He was on his knees in the dirt, in his shirt sleeves, with a trowel in his hand, and a smudge of earth across his cheek, setting out the small, pale rose bushes he had ordered from Hampshire. Rosa alba semiplena, the kind his mother had loved, along the south border of the garden, where for 5 years nothing had grown but weeds. Selka was beside him, in an apron, with mud on her hands, laughing at something he had said. Marisol stood in the doorway and watched them. After a moment, Theron looked up. He saw her. He smiled. He had smiled in the past 6 months, more than he had in the previous 20 years, and Marisol had not, even now, become accustomed to it. She crossed the gravel path and knelt beside them, and Selka handed her a trowel, and the three of them planted roses together until the noon bell rang from the chapel at Edenholt. That night, after Selka had gone to bed, Marisol and Theron sat together in the library. He was reading. She was writing. A long letter to Lord Crenshaw, who had become a friend. He had sent them a wedding present in February, on the occasion of their first true anniversary, which neither of them had mentioned aloud, but which both of them had marked in their hearts. The fire burned low. Theron set down his book. He said, "Marisol, yes. There is a thing I have wanted to say for some time, and I have not known how to begin." She put down her pen. "Begin." He looked at the fire. "I would like, if you are willing, for us to mark the day Crenshaw rode up the drive. Not the wedding day. The day Crenshaw came was the first day, my love, that anyone in either of our lives gave you a choice, and you made it. I would like to mark that day, every year, as ours." She was silent. Then she said, "What did you have in mind?" He almost smiled. "That on the 17th of October each year we might ride together, you and I, and Selka, when she is grown, to the chapel at Edenholt, and sit there for an hour. Not to pray, only to sit. To remember that we were given a second beginning, and that we did not waste it. And then to come home and read aloud to each other for an hour by the fire." She rose. She crossed to him. She knelt beside the chair, put her arms around his shoulders, pressed her face into his hair, and said, "Yes, my love. Every year, for as long as we have." Outside, the April rain began against the eastern window of Ravensmere Hall, soft and steady, the way it had begun on the first day of everything. Marisol heard it. She did not let go of him, and Theron, who had once been a duke who looked through his wife and was now a man who had learned to look at her, turned his face into her shoulder, and he did not speak, because speech was no longer the only language they had between them. The rain fell, the house slept, and in the small wooden box on the writing desk, beside the thimble from Lisbon, the silver locket that had once been her mother's caught the last firelight and glinted, faintly, like a held promise. If you have stayed with me to the end of this story, thank you. You are the reason these stories exist, readers who believe that love is not always loud, that grace can arrive late, and that the quiet courage of staying is its own kind of beginning. If a moment moved you, I would love to know which one. And if you would like more stories of marriages remembered and women who choose their own answers, please consider subscribing. Until next time, dear listener, be gentle with yourself, and may someone be looking at you the way you deserve.